Why are single men happier than you think? A lot of single men are not actually miserable. A lot of them are doing better than fine. Society likes to push the idea, oh, men are lost without a woman. That's a lie. For years now, men have been told that their happiness only comes from marriage and kids and overall settling down. But modern relationships don't offer men the same benefits that they used to. Men aren't wrong for asking, what's in it for me, before they go into a really serious relationship. Single men today have financial freedom and overall peace of mind. They have control over their own lives. They're traveling, building businesses, hitting the gym, and overall going after their goals. And until women are willing to offer a little bit more in relationships, this is going to continue. Holding men to these outdated expectations, but also a variety of new ones that show up every single day, is just not doing it for them. And they're not going to continue having relationships if this keeps up.
There are moments in history where a single policy reveals far more than it claims on the surface. Moments where a government says one thing, but the underlying message tells an entirely different story. What Japan is preparing to introduce in 2026 is one of those moments. A new tax aimed at single people, framed as support for families, framed as a solution to demographic decline, framed as a public good. But if you slow down, if you actually examine who pays, who benefits, and who carries the burden, a very different picture emerges. This is not about families. This is about control, pressure, and consequences that many did not anticipate. And by the end of this video, the ripple effects of this decision will be impossible to ignore. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment we release it. That support helps more than you realize and keeps these conversations going. Also, take a moment to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, linked in the description below. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets, how to grow your wealth responsibly, and how to buy, sell, and trade crypto with clarity instead of confusion, that is exactly what the Academy is built for. The link is in the description. Go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can always buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps keep the lights on and the content coming. Now let us talk about what is really happening. Starting in 2026, single people in Japan will be required to pay a new tax. The official explanation is that this tax will support families and encourage family growth. That sounds reasonable on the surface. Many countries are struggling with aging populations, declining birth rates, and economic pressure. Japan has been dealing with these challenges for decades, but policy intent does not exist in a vacuum. The real impact of a tax is not determined by what it claims to support, but by who actually pays it and how it changes behavior. Here is a reality that rarely gets discussed openly. Men pay the overwhelming majority of taxes. Women account for the majority of consumer spending. When you design a tax that targets singles, especially in a country where marriage rates are declining and men already shoulder most of the tax burden, the outcome is predictable. This tax will be paid disproportionately by single men, not because men are singled out in the wording, but because they are singled out in the structure of society itself. In practical terms, this functions less like a family support tax and more like a financial penalty for remaining single. It is a surcharge on autonomy, a signal that opting out of traditional life paths will come with a cost. And for many men, the message is clear. If you do not marry, if you do not have children, if you do not participate in the social structure as defined by the state, you will pay extra. This is where the problem begins. Japanese workers already face some of the highest tax rates in the developed world. Wage growth has stagnated for years. Work hours are long, often excessive. Disposable income is limited. When you add another layer of taxation, you're not creating incentives. You are creating pressure. And pressure does not automatically produce compliance. Often, it produces withdrawal. Men cannot simply work more hours to offset this. Many already work at or beyond sustainable limits. There is no hidden reservoir of extra productivity waiting to be unlocked. What does exist is the ability to step back, to consume less, to simplify, and to disengage. And this is exactly where policymakers miscalculate. When the cost of participation rises without a corresponding benefit, rational people adjust. They reduce their exposure, they minimize obligations, they reassess what is actually worth the effort. This is not rebellion, this is adaptation. I have said many times that the average man can live comfortably with very little. That is not an insult or a boast. It is an observation. Men, on average, require fewer external comforts to feel content. When systems become hostile or extractive, men tend to retreat rather than fight. They downsize. They reduce consumption. They limit interaction. They focus on what they can control. Policies like this do not pull men back into society, they push them further away. What the government frames as encouragement feels to many like coercion. And coercion breeds resistance, even if that resistance is quiet. Instead of working harder, men work less. Instead of spending more, they spend less. Instead of integrating, they isolate. This leads to a paradox where the very policy designed to extract more resources ends up shrinking the taxable base over time. This is not theoretical. We have already seen this pattern play out across multiple societies. When participation becomes punitive, disengagement becomes attractive. At the same time, this tax reinforces a growing perception that society views men primarily as resources, not as individuals, not as partners, not as contributors with agency, but as inputs to be managed. Pay more, work more, give more, receive less. And when men internalize that message long enough, they stop arguing with it. They simply leave. This is what people mean when they talk about men walking away. It is not a dramatic exit. It is not a protest march. It is a gradual detachment. Less involvement, less investment, less willingness to play a game that feels increasingly one sided. The result is not chaos, it is silence. And silence is far more dangerous to systems built on participation than open conflict. Over the past several decades, many men have been told repeatedly that they are unnecessary, that their presence is optional, that their contributions are assumed rather than appreciated, that their natural tendencies are problems to be corrected rather than traits to be balanced. Over time, those messages accumulate, they shape behavior, they change priorities. When you tell people long enough that they are not needed, eventually they believe you. And once they believe you, they stop showing up. This is where the broader cultural context matters. For years, social narratives have framed men as liabilities rather than assets. Institutions have increasingly treated men as something to regulate rather than support. In family courts, in social policy, in public discourse, the message has often been that men are replaceable, interchangeable, or secondary. Whether one agrees with that framing or not, the behavioral outcome is measurable. Men disengage. When men disengage from relationships, from family formation, from consumer culture, and from social obligation, systems that rely on their participation begin to strain. Birth rates decline further. Tax revenue stagnates. Support structures weaken. And rather than addressing the root causes, the response is often to increase pressure. That is what this tax represents. Instead of asking why people are opting out, it attempts to penalize them for doing so. This is where the policy truly backfires. Men who feel targeted do not suddenly decide to comply. They decide to protect themselves. They reduce risk. They avoid commitments that expose them to further extraction. They focus on stability, predictability, and self preservation. Many men discover something important during this process. Being alone is not the same as being lonely. Solitude can be peaceful, independence can be fulfilling, a simple life can be a good life. Once that realization sets in, it is very difficult to reverse. This is why attempts to push men back into traditional structures through financial penalties fail. The cost is clear, the benefit is not. And when the benefit is unclear, rational actors opt out. What makes the situation even more complicated is the feedback loop it creates. As more men disengage, the pressure on those who remain increases. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Taxes rise, expectations rise, resentment grows. This accelerates the cycle rather than stopping it. The tax becomes not a solution, but a symbol of a system that no longer understands the people it depends on. At the same time, women are also impacted by these shifts, though often in different ways. As men withdraw, many women experience increased economic and emotional pressure. Support that was once assumed becomes scarce. Social structures change. Expectations clash with reality. This creates tension, confusion, and frustration on all sides. The critical mistake is assuming that behavior can be engineered purely through financial incentives without addressing trust, fairness, and mutual benefit. People do not build families because they are taxed into it. They build families because the environment feels stable, supportive, and rewarding. Remove those conditions, and no tax can fix the outcome. Men increasingly rely on pattern recognition rather than promises. They observe outcomes, they adjust accordingly. Words matter less than results. And the results they see do not encourage participation. As men focus more on minimalism, on reducing costs, on limiting exposure, entire industries feel the shift. Consumer spending changes, housing demand shifts, entertainment consumption evolves. The ripple effects extend far beyond relationships. What policymakers often fail to understand is that men do not need much to be content. When systems become adversarial, men simplify their lives rather than fight to maintain complexity. This is not collapse, it is quiet withdrawal. And the more pressure that is applied, the faster it happens. This tax, framed as support, will be interpreted by many as a fine for opting out, a cost imposed not for wrongdoing, but for non participation. That perception alone undermines its legitimacy. Once legitimacy erodes, compliance becomes purely transactional. People do the minimum required, nothing more. That is not how you rebuild a society. That is how you hollow one out. As we move forward, it is important to understand that policies like this do not exist in isolation. They interact with cultural narratives, economic realities, and individual psychology. Ignoring any one of those elements leads to unintended consequences. Men are not disappearing, they are adapting. They are choosing peace over pressure, stability over struggle, simplicity over obligation. And once that shift occurs at scale, it does not reverse easily. This is only the beginning of the conversation. What we are witnessing in Japan is not unique. It is a preview, a case study in what happens when institutions attempt to manage outcomes without understanding motivation, and systems built on participation cannot survive silence. To understand why policies like this accelerate disengagement instead of reversing it, you have to look backward before you look forward. These outcomes did not appear overnight. They are the result of decades of accumulated incentives, messaging, and lived experience. People rarely change direction because of a single rule. They change because that rule confirms what they already feel to be true. For many men, the feeling that society no longer values them did not start with a tax. It started with a slow shift in how responsibility and accountability were distributed. Over time, obligations increased while rewards diminished. Expectations rose while appreciation declined. And eventually, Participation began to feel less like cooperation and more like obligation without consent. When that line is crossed, behavior changes. In earlier generations, men were told that their role mattered, that their efforts would translate into stability, family, and respect. Work was demanding, but it had a purpose. Sacrifice had meaning. Even when conditions were harsh, there was a sense of direction, a sense that effort would be met with something tangible. Over time, that social contract eroded. Men were increasingly told that they were not needed in the same way, that their contributions were assumed rather than recognized, that their instincts were outdated, that their presence was optional unless it involved paying, providing, or fixing problems. This shift did not happen all at once. It crept in through policy, media, education, and cultural norms. At the same time, systems that once balanced responsibility became more one sided. Legal frameworks evolved, social expectations shifted, risk became asymmetric. The cost of failure rose while the margin for error shrank. Men noticed, they noticed that participation carried increasing downside with decreasing upside. That effort did not guarantee outcomes. That commitment did not guarantee stability. That trust was often met with exposure rather than security. When people notice patterns like that, they adapt. The adaptation did not look like anger for long. Anger burns out. What replaced it was calculation, assessment, quiet decisions made over time, decisions to opt out of unnecessary risk, decisions to simplify, decisions to protect peace. This is the context in which policies like the single tax land, not on a blank slate, but on a surface already marked by experience. When the government says this tax is about supporting families, many men hear something else entirely. They hear that their autonomy is being priced, that their personal choices are now subject to penalties. That participation is no longer voluntary, but financially enforced. That framing matters. If people do not respond to intent, they respond to impact. For a man already working long hours with limited disposable income, this tax is not abstract. It is a subtraction. Less saved, less invested, less flexibility, and critically, no clear benefit in return. The assumption behind the policy is that pressure will push men toward marriage and family formation. But that assumption misunderstands motivation. People do not build families because they are financially punished for not doing so. They build families when they believe the environment is stable, fair, and supportive. When those conditions are absent, pressure backfires. Instead of increasing engagement, it incentivizes avoidance. Instead of deepening ties, it encourages distance. Instead of strengthening society, it weakens trust. Men begin to ask different questions. Not how can I contribute more, but how can I reduce exposure? Not how do I build within this system, but how do I live alongside it with minimal friction? This is where minimalism enters the picture. Minimalism is not a trend, it is a response. When systems become costly, complexity becomes optional. Men discover that many of the things they were told they needed were never essential to begin with. Smaller living spaces, fewer possessions, lower expenses, less obligation. This shift is not driven by bitterness. It is driven by efficiency. If working more does not meaningfully improve life, then working less becomes rational. If spending more does not increase happiness, then spending less becomes freeing. If engagement carries risk without reward, then disengagement becomes attractive. These decisions are not dramatic, they are quiet, and because they are quiet, they are often misunderstood or ignored by those in power. From the outside, it may look like apathy. In reality, it is recalibration. As more men make these adjustments, the broader consequences become visible. Economic activity shifts, consumption patterns change, demand for certain goods declines. Entire sectors built on assumptions of growth feel pressure. Governments respond to these signals not by reassessing incentives, but by doubling down on extraction. More taxes, more penalties, more pressure. Each cycle accelerates the next. This is the pattern Japan is now entering with this policy. At the same time, women are experiencing their own recalibration. Many grew up in an environment that emphasized independence and self sufficiency, while also assuming that traditional support structures would still exist. That assumption is now being tested. As men withdraw from dating, from financial sponsorship, from emotional labor, the gap between expectation and reality widens. This creates frustration, confusion, a sense that something is missing, but frustration does not automatically translate into understanding. Instead of asking why men are disengaging, the focus often shifts to how to compel them back. Social pressure, financial penalties, moral arguments, none of which address the underlying imbalance. Compulsion cannot replace trust. And without trust, cooperation fails. One of the most overlooked aspects of this shift is how deeply it affects long term planning. Men who disengage from traditional paths stop planning for futures that depend on institutions they no longer trust. They save differently, invest differently, live differently. They prioritize liquidity over leverage, flexibility over permanence, peace over status. This has cascading effects. Housing markets change when fewer people seek large family homes. Consumer markets change when spending becomes restrained. Labor markets change when workers choose balance over advancement. These are not isolated decisions, they aggregate. The irony is that the more men simplify their lives, the less leverage systems have over them. Lower expenses mean less dependency. Less dependency means more freedom to opt out. This makes future attempts at pressure even less effective. The single tax, rather than binding men more tightly to society, loosens the connection further. And once that connection weakens, rebuilding it becomes extraordinarily difficult. Trust, once broken, does not return because of policy changes. It returns through consistency, fairness, and mutual benefit over time. Right now, many men do not see that path. They see a system that reacts to declining participation by demanding more from those who remain, rather than asking why participation declined in the first place. They see a narrative that frames their withdrawal as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be understood. They see solutions imposed rather than conditions improved. This is why rhetoric matters less than results. Men increasingly rely on what they can observe: who benefits, who pays, who is protected, who is exposed. Patterns tell a story, and that story shapes behavior more than any official explanation. As this continues, a quiet divide forms, not a dramatic confrontation, but a separation of paths. Those who still believe in institutional promises continue to invest. Those who do not quietly step back. Neither group announces their decision, but the aggregate effect is undeniable. When fewer men pursue relationships, family formation declines further. When fewer men commit long term, stability becomes scarce. When fewer men engage economically beyond necessity, growth slows. The response from institutions is often confusion. Why are incentives not working? Why are penalties ineffective? Why does pressure not produce compliance? The answer is simple but uncomfortable. You cannot tax trust into existence. Trust is built through fairness, through reciprocity, through environments where effort reliably produces reward, through systems that acknowledge risk and share it equitably. Absent that, people protect themselves. This is not unique to men. But men, because of their ability to simplify, often lead the withdrawal. And once that withdrawal reaches a certain scale, Reversing it requires more than policy adjustments. It requires cultural change. Cultural change is slow. It requires humility. It requires listening. It requires acknowledging mistakes. That is not something large institutions are known for doing well. Instead, they often pursue short term fixes, revenue now, compliance now, solutions that look good on paper but ignore behavior. The single tax fits this pattern perfectly. It attempts to solve a demographic issue with a financial lever without addressing why people are opting out of family formation in the first place. High living costs, long work hours, limited flexibility, legal risk, social expectations that feel mismatched with reality. Until those factors are addressed, no tax will reverse the trend. Men are not confused. They are responding logically to the environment presented to them. They are choosing stability over struggle, peace over pressure, simplicity over obligation. This is not the end of society, but it is a transformation, one that policymakers ignore at their own risk. Because once people learn they can live well with less, they do not easily return to systems that demand more without offering more in return. And as this mindset spreads, it reshapes everything it touches. The question is not whether this tax will work. It is whether those who designed it understand the behavior it will produce. So far, history suggests they do not. And that brings us to the deeper issue. This is not about Japan alone. This is about a broader shift happening across developed societies. Japan is simply further along the curve. What we are watching is the consequence of misaligned incentives playing out over time. A slow unraveling of assumptions that once held society together. When discussions turn toward gender relations and social participation, one of the most consistent mistakes institutions make is assuming that behavior can be corrected without first restoring trust. Trust is not an accessory to cooperation, it is the foundation of it. Without trust, people comply only when forced, and even then, only to the minimum extent required. This is the dynamic now unfolding, not just in Japan, but across much of the developed world. For decades, the cultural messaging directed at men followed a predictable arc. First, men were told they needed to change, then they were told they were the problem. Eventually, they were told they were unnecessary. Each stage carried consequences, but it was the final message that altered behavior most dramatically. When people internalize that they are not needed, they stop trying to be. This did not happen because of one movement, one policy, or one generation. It happened because of repetition. Repetition through media, repetition through education, repetition through social narratives that framed male participation as conditional and male contribution as expected but unappreciated. Over time, that repetition reshaped priorities. Men did not disappear overnight, they adjusted. They became quieter, more selective, less willing to engage in environments where the cost of participation outweighed the benefit. This was not resentment. It was adaptation. And what followed was a widening disconnect between expectation and reality. Many systems continued to operate as if male participation was guaranteed. Dating markets assumed pursuit would continue. Economic systems assumed productivity would increase. Governments assumed compliance would remain stable. None of those assumptions accounted for withdrawal. When men step back, the first impact is subtle. Fewer dates, fewer marriages, fewer long term commitments, less discretionary spending, less overtime, less engagement beyond what is strictly necessary. On paper, these shifts appear minor. In aggregate, they are transformational. The mistake policymakers often make is interpreting these changes as temporary. They assume disengagement is a phase, something that will correct itself if the right incentives are applied. But disengagement, once normalized, becomes a lifestyle, and lifestyles do not reverse easily. Men who simplify their lives discover something important. They realize that peace is undervalued in modern society. That stability does not require excess. That contentment is possible without constant striving. This realization alters decision making permanently. Once a man learns he can live well with less, the leverage institutions have over him diminishes. Fewer expenses mean fewer obligations. Fewer obligations mean greater autonomy. Autonomy, once experienced, is rarely surrendered voluntarily. This is why policies that increase pressure often fail. They are applied to a population that has already discovered how to minimize exposure. Increasing costs does not force compliance, it accelerates withdrawal. At the same time, there is a growing disconnect in how different groups interpret these outcomes. Many women experience the effects of male disengagement as abandonment or avoidance. They see fewer approaches, less investment, reduced willingness to commit. This can feel confusing or unfair, especially when expectations were shaped in a different era. However, perception does not change behavior, only incentives do. Men are not responding to words, they are responding to outcomes. When outcomes consistently signal risk without reward, avoidance becomes rational. And this is where conversations often break down. One side speaks in terms of fairness and entitlement, the other speaks in terms of cost and risk. Without a shared framework, neither side feels heard. The introduction of a tax on single people reinforces this disconnect. Rather than addressing why people are opting out of family formation, it attempts to penalize the outcome itself. This approach treats behavior as a defect rather than a signal. Signals exist for a reason. When large numbers of people opt out of a system, it is rarely because they misunderstand it. It is because they understand it very well and decide the trade off is not worth it. This is especially true for men who tend to evaluate systems pragmatically. If effort does not reliably produce benefit, effort is reduced. If risk is not balanced by reward, risk is avoided. These are not emotional decisions, they are practical ones. The irony is that many of the policies designed to increase participation actually validate the very concerns driving disengagement. When men see governments imposing penalties for remaining single, it confirms their belief that autonomy is being eroded, that personal choices are no longer respected, that participation is no longer voluntary. This validation strengthens resolve rather than weakening it. Men respond by doubling down on independence, by reducing ties, by avoiding commitments that increase exposure to future policy shifts. This includes marriage, shared assets, and long term financial entanglements. From an institutional perspective, this behavior is difficult to track because it does not manifest as protest. There are no rallies, no demands, no organized resistance. There is simply absence, and absence is harder to confront than opposition. As this absence grows, institutions struggle to adapt. Systems designed around constant growth and participation begin to strain. Tax bases shrink. Social programs face funding gaps. Labor shortages emerge in unexpected places. The instinctive response is to increase pressure on those who remain. Higher taxes, more regulations, more incentives layered on top of penalties. Each response compounds the problem. The core issue remains untouched. The environment does not feel fair. The rewards do not feel proportional. The risks feel unbalanced. Until those perceptions change, behavior will not reverse. What makes this moment particularly significant is how technology amplifies these shifts. Men are no longer isolated in their experiences, they share observations, Compare outcomes. Recognize patterns. This collective awareness accelerates adaptation. When one man discovers that a simpler life brings peace, others notice. When one man opts out and thrives, others reconsider their assumptions. This creates a feedback loop that institutions are slow to recognize. The narrative that men need society more than society needs men no longer holds when men discover how little they require to live well. This is a fundamental shift in leverage. Historically, social systems relied on male participation through obligation and expectation. Work to provide, commit to build, sacrifice for stability. Those expectations worked because the return was visible and reliable. When that reliability disappears, so does compliance. This is why attempts to shame, pressure, or penalize men back into participation fail. Shame only works when people value approval. Penalties only work when people fear loss. Men who have simplified their lives fear very little. And this does not mean men are hostile to society. It means they are indifferent to systems that no longer serve them. Indifference is far more destabilizing than opposition. As this indifference grows, social narratives begin to fracture. Some double down on old assumptions, others acknowledge reality. The gap between expectation and behavior widens. Women who expected traditional dynamics find themselves navigating a landscape where those dynamics no longer exist. Men who were once expected to pursue now wait or do not engage at all. The result is confusion rather than clarity. This confusion often leads to misplaced blame. Instead of examining incentives, people assign moral failure. Instead of adjusting systems, they criticize individuals. This further erodes trust. Trust cannot survive moralizing where incentives are misaligned. In Japan's case, the stakes are particularly high because demographic decline is already severe. The margin for error is small. Policies that accelerate disengagement risk, compounding an already fragile situation. The assumption that men can be financially pressured into family formation ignores decades of cultural and economic context. It treats a complex social issue as a simple compliance problem. History shows this approach does not work. Family formation thrives in environments of stability, opportunity, and shared responsibility, not in environments of coercion. Men who feel valued invest. Men who feel exploited withdraw. The difference between those two outcomes lies not in slogans or taxes, but in lived experience. As more men step away from traditional expectations, society enters unfamiliar territory. Roles that were once assumed become optional. Structures that relied on participation must adapt or contract. This is not inherently negative. Change can lead to innovation, but only if it is acknowledged honestly. Ignoring reality does not stop it. What we are witnessing is a recalibration of priorities, men choosing peace over performance, stability over status, autonomy over obligation. These choices are not reversible through policy alone. They require cultural realignment. Until that happens, each new attempt to force engagement will accelerate disengagement. The single tax is not a solution. It is a signal that institutions are responding to absence with pressure rather than reflection. And pressure without trust produces exactly one outcome: withdrawal. When large numbers of men withdraw from traditional participation, the consequences do not appear immediately dramatic. There is no single moment where everything stops working. Instead, systems begin to feel strained in subtle ways. Small inefficiencies compound. Gaps appear where reliability once existed. And over time, what once felt stable begins to feel fragile. This is how structural decline actually unfolds, not through collapse, but through erosion. Economic systems are particularly sensitive to this kind of withdrawal. Modern economies are built on assumptions of continuous engagement, steady labor participation, and predictable consumer behavior. When men reduce spending, reduce hours, and avoid long term commitments, those assumptions weaken. Demand becomes inconsistent. Labor supply becomes selective. Productivity becomes uneven. What makes this difficult for policymakers is that the behavior looks voluntary. People are still working, still paying taxes, still functioning within the system. They are simply doing the minimum required. The difference between maximum participation and minimum compliance is enormous, yet it is often invisible in short term data. This is where many governments misread the situation. They see compliance and assume engagement. They see tax revenue and assume stability. But beneath the surface, the willingness to go beyond obligation is disappearing. When men no longer believe that effort leads to security, they stop striving. They do their jobs, but they do not invest emotionally. They meet requirements, but they do not innovate. They show up, but they do not commit. And this shift has profound implications for long term growth. Societies advance not because people comply, but because they believe participation benefits them. When that belief fades, stagnation follows. The single tax accelerates this stagnation by reinforcing the perception that participation is extracted rather than earned. Instead of rewarding family formation, it penalizes non participation. This distinction matters more than policymakers realize. Rewards create aspiration, penalties create avoidance. Men who already feel ambivalent about long term commitments interpret the tax as confirmation that the system views them as a resource rather than a partner. That interpretation changes behavior permanently. At the same time, future generations observe these outcomes and adjust preemptively. Younger men watch older men disengage and avoid similar paths altogether. They learn from observation rather than experience. This accelerates the trend. Cultural transmission no longer depends on institutions. It happens peer to peer through shared stories and visible outcomes. When men see that simplicity leads to peace while complexity leads to stress, they internalize that lesson early. This has long term demographic consequences. Fewer families are formed, fewer children are born, support ratios shrink. Social systems built on intergenerational continuity face increasing pressure. The response from institutions is often reactive rather than reflective. Instead of addressing why participation declined, they attempt to compensate by increasing extraction. Higher taxes, broader penalties, more regulations. Each intervention treats the symptom rather than the cause. The cause remains unaddressed because it is uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging that trust has been broken, that incentives are misaligned, that decades of messaging and policy choices produced unintended outcomes. Admitting that would require humility. Instead, systems prefer control. Control, however, only works when people have no alternative. Men who simplify their lives create alternatives for themselves: lower expenses, fewer dependencies, greater flexibility. These choices reduce the effectiveness of control mechanisms. When people have options, coercion loses power. This dynamic also reshapes social expectations around relationships. Men who disengage from traditional paths do not disappear. They simply opt out of frameworks that no longer serve them. They pursue friendships, hobbies, personal goals, and solitude without seeking validation from institutions that previously defined success. This creates a mismatch in expectations. Many women were raised with narratives that assumed male pursuit, provision, and persistence. When those behaviors decline, confusion follows, not because women did something wrong individually, but because the environment changed faster than expectations. This mismatch often leads to frustration on both sides. Men feel misunderstood. Women feel unsupported. Without a shared understanding of incentives, dialogue breaks down. The introduction of punitive policies does not bridge this gap, it widens it. Instead of fostering cooperation, it reinforces adversarial dynamics. Men feel targeted, women feel promised outcomes that do not materialize. Institutions feel frustrated that compliance does not produce desired results. Everyone loses. The most overlooked aspect of this shift is how it affects resilience. Societies rely on informal cooperation during stress, voluntary effort, mutual aid, people going beyond obligation. When disengagement becomes normalized, that informal resilience weakens. People still help those they trust, still support those they value. But the circle narrows, community shrinks, responsibility becomes conditional. This is not cynicism, it is prioritization. Men who feel exploited prioritize self preservation. They invest energy where returns are reliable. They avoid systems that have proven unpredictable. This behavior makes sense at the individual level. At scale, it transforms society. Japan's demographic challenge did not emerge in isolation. It developed alongside economic stagnation, rigid work culture, and social expectations that became increasingly difficult to meet. The single tax addresses none of these issues. It simply adds pressure to an already strained system. Pressure without reform accelerates exit. What policymakers often overlook is that men are not asking for special treatment. They are asking for fairness, predictability, environments where commitment is rewarded rather than punished. When those conditions are absent, disengagement is rational. This rational disengagement is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes normal. Men stop planning decades ahead. Stop investing in structures they do not trust. Stop building lives that depend on policy stability. Instead, they build portable lives, flexible arrangements, plans that can adapt quickly. This makes long term social planning more difficult. Institutions struggle to forecast behavior when people avoid permanence. The irony is that the more institutions attempt to force permanence through penalties, the more people avoid it. Marriage, homeownership, and long term commitments require confidence in the future. Taxes that penalize current status signal uncertainty rather than stability. Men interpret this uncertainty as risk. Risk avoidance becomes the guiding principle. Over time, this reshapes values. Success is no longer defined by accumulation or status, but by autonomy and peace. Stability is measured by low dependency rather than high income. These values spread quietly but persistently. When younger men observe older men thriving outside traditional frameworks, they adopt similar strategies earlier. This creates a generational acceleration effect. Policies designed for a previous era fail because the underlying assumptions no longer hold. Institutions that cannot adapt to this reality face decline. The most important lesson here is that behavior follows incentives, not narratives. Governments can frame taxes however they want, but people respond to lived experience. If the experience of participation feels extractive, participation declines. If the experience of independence feels peaceful, independence spreads. This is not ideology, it is observation. The single tax will not reverse demographic decline. It will deepen disengagement. It will confirm suspicions. It will push more men toward minimalism and withdrawal. The long term cost of this policy will not be measured immediately. It will appear gradually in lower innovation, weaker social cohesion, and shrinking resilience. By the time those effects become undeniable, reversing them will require far more than removing a tax. It will require rebuilding trust that has been eroded over decades. Trust cannot be legislated, it must be earned. And earning it requires listening, fairness, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Until that happens, each new attempt to force engagement will push people further away. As disengagement becomes normalized, one of the most profound changes occurs beneath the surface in how people think about time. Long term thinking depends on confidence. It depends on the belief that commitments made today will still make sense years from now. When that belief weakens, people shorten their planning horizon. They focus on the present and near future, not out of recklessness, but out of caution. Men who no longer trust long term systems begin to live in shorter cycles. They plan months ahead instead of decades. They make decisions that can be reversed. They avoid paths that lock them into outcomes they cannot control. This mindset spreads quietly but reshapes society in fundamental ways. Shorter planning horizons reduce long term investment, not just financial investment, but emotional and social investment. Why invest deeply in systems that may penalize you later for choices you cannot undo? Why commit to structures that expose you to changing rules? This is where the idea of stability fractures. Stability is no longer seen as permanence, it is seen as adaptability. Men who adopt this mindset become highly resilient on an individual level. They can move, adjust, reconfigure their lives quickly. But this individual resilience comes at the cost of collective continuity. Societies rely on people who are willing to plant trees they may never sit under. That willingness depends on trust. When trust erodes, people stop planting. The single tax sends a clear message that rules can change based on personal status. That message lingers. Even men who can afford the tax absorb the implication. If this can be taxed today, what can be taxed tomorrow? What choices will be penalized next? This uncertainty is corrosive. Once uncertainty enters the system, risk tolerance drops. People become conservative, not politically, but behaviorally. They avoid exposure. They limit commitments. They prioritize self sufficiency. These decisions ripple outward. Businesses struggle to forecast demand. Employers struggle to retain long term talent. Communities struggle to maintain continuity. Everything becomes more transactional. Transactional systems function, but they do not thrive. In a transactional society, people do what is required, nothing more. They comply, but they do not care. They participate, but they do not invest emotionally. Over time, this hollows out institutions from within. The most damaging aspect of the shift is that it is invisible until it is advanced. Metrics lag behavior. By the time disengagement appears in official data, it has already reshaped norms. This is why many policymakers are surprised by declining participation. They assumed compliance equaled buy in. It does not. Buy in requires belief, belief requires consistency, consistency requires fairness. When any of those break, systems weaken. Men are not rejecting society out of hostility. They are responding to signals, signals that tell them participation is risky, unrewarded, and increasingly penalized. When people feel punished for choices that do not harm others, they reassess their relationship with authority. They become cautious, skeptical, reserved. This skepticism extends beyond taxes. It affects how men view institutions broadly: legal systems, social programs, cultural expectations. Trust declines across the board. When trust declines, cooperation shrinks. This is especially damaging during periods of economic or social stress. Crises require voluntary effort, extra hours, creative problem solving, shared sacrifice. Those behaviors depend on goodwill. Goodwill cannot be commanded, it must exist before the crisis. By penalizing non participation, instead of restoring trust, Policies like the single tax erode the very goodwill they will one day depend on. Another overlooked consequence is how disengagement reshapes masculinity itself. Traditional definitions tied masculinity to provision, protection, and responsibility within a family structure. As that structure becomes less accessible or less appealing, definitions change. Men redefine success in quieter terms: peace, autonomy, health, control over time. These values are not inferior, but they are incompatible with systems that rely on constant expansion and obligation. As masculinity shifts, so do social dynamics. Competition gives way to withdrawal, status seeking gives way to privacy, visibility gives way to discretion. Men become harder to mobilize because they are harder to reach. They are less present in public spaces, less invested in collective narratives. This creates a feedback loop where institutions struggle to communicate with the very population they need to engage. At the same time, women navigating this new landscape face their own challenges. Expectations shaped by previous norms collide with present reality. Opportunities for traditional partnership shrink. Support structures change. This does not mean women are powerless. It means the environment has changed. And change requires adjustment on all sides. Unfortunately, public discourse often frames these shifts as moral failures rather than adaptive responses. That framing prevents understanding. It turns analysis into accusation. Accusation drives further withdrawal. Men who feel blamed rather than understood retreat further into privacy. They disengage from public debate. They avoid spaces where their motives are questioned rather than examined. This silence is often mistaken for agreement. It is not, it is disengagement. As this continues, societies face a paradox. They become more regulated while becoming less cohesive, more controlled while being less cooperative. Control can manage behavior in the short term. It cannot sustain trust long term. The single tax exemplifies this paradox. It attempts to engineer outcomes through financial pressure without addressing why those outcomes no longer occur organically. Family formation declined because conditions changed. Costs rose, stability fell, risk increased, social expectations became mismatched with economic reality. Until those conditions improve, no tax will reverse the trend. Men are not withholding participation out of spite, they are responding to incentives, and incentives are shaped by outcomes, not intentions. The deeper issue is that many institutions still operate on outdated assumptions about motivation. They assume fear of penalty outweighs desire for autonomy. They assume people prefer compliance to simplicity. Those assumptions are increasingly wrong. Men who have tasted autonomy value it highly. They protect it. They structure their lives to preserve it. This makes them resistant to policies that threaten autonomy, even indirectly. Resistance does not always look like defiance. Often it looks like absence from dating markets, absence from civic engagement, absence from ambition beyond necessity. This absence is difficult to address because it does not break rules. It simply declines to participate enthusiastically. No policy can force enthusiasm. Enthusiasm grows where people feel respected, valued, and secure. The path forward, if one exists, does not lie in penalties. It lies in rebuilding environments where long term commitment makes sense again. That means affordable living, predictable rules, balanced risk, shared responsibility. It means acknowledging that trust was damaged and cannot be restored through enforcement. Rebuilding trust requires consistency over time. It requires institutions to demonstrate fairness, not demand compliance. Until that happens, disengagement will continue. Japan's single tax is not an isolated policy. It is a symptom of a broader pattern, a pattern of responding to declining participation with increased pressure rather than reflection. History suggests this pattern does not end well. Societies that thrive adapt to behavior rather than attempting to coerce it. They align incentives with reality. They listen when people opt out. Ignoring opt out behavior does not make it disappear, it accelerates it. The men walking away today are not radicals. They are pragmatists. They are responding to what they see, not what they are told. They see systems that demand more while offering less. They see instability where permanence is required. They see penalties where encouragement was promised, so they choose peace, they choose simplicity, they choose distance. This choice reshapes everything. As disengagement deepens, it eventually reaches a point where it begins to affect political legitimacy itself. Governments do not exist solely through laws and enforcement, they exist through consent, participation, and belief. When large segments of the population comply only out of obligation rather than conviction, legitimacy becomes fragile. The system still functions, but it no longer commands loyalty. Men who have withdrawn from long term social participation often disengage politically as well. They vote less, they engage less in public debate, they avoid identification with institutions that no longer reflect their priorities. This does not mean they are unaware. It means they are unconvinced that engagement will lead to meaningful change. Political systems rely heavily on the assumption that people care enough to participate. When that assumption weakens, policy feedback loops break down. Leaders misinterpret silence as acceptance. They confuse absence of protest with approval. In reality, silence often reflects resignation. This resignation is dangerous because it erodes accountability. When people stop believing their participation matters, power consolidates. Decisions become detached from lived experience. Policies are crafted in abstraction without grounding in behavior. The single tax reflects this disconnect. It assumes that pressure can substitute for belief, that compliance can replace commitment, that participation can be forced rather than earned. History shows this approach consistently fails. Societies remain stable, not because people are compelled to comply, but because they believe the system serves them fairly. When that belief disappears, stability becomes brittle. Men who have simplified their lives do not fear instability the way institutions do. Their resilience comes from flexibility, not permanence. They can adapt to changes that would destabilize more complex lives. This reduces their dependence on state guarantees. As dependence declines, leverage declines. This creates a widening gap between institutions that rely on participation and individuals who no longer feel bound by it. The result is a quiet standoff. The state increases pressure. Individuals reduce exposure. Neither side escalates openly, but the distance grows. Over time, this distance reshapes civic culture. Public spaces feel emptier. Collective projects struggle to attract volunteers. Shared identity weakens. Everything becomes transactional. Transactional societies can survive, but they lack cohesion. They struggle in moments that require sacrifice without immediate reward. They lack the glue that holds people together when incentives alone are insufficient. The irony is that men walking away are often blamed for this erosion when in reality they are responding to it. Withdrawal is not the cause, it is the symptom. When institutions treat people as inputs rather than participants, disengagement follows. This disengagement has generational consequences. Children raised in environments where long term commitment is rare internalize different expectations. They grow up seeing flexibility prioritized over permanence. They learn to value independence early. This shapes future behavior. Younger men entering adulthood observe the outcomes of older generations. They see the risks of overcommitment. They see the benefits of simplicity. They adjust accordingly. This creates a compounding effect. Each generation disengages earlier, with fewer illusions about institutional guarantees. By the time policymakers react, the cultural shift is already embedded. Reversing such shifts requires more than removing penalties. It requires restoring confidence that long term participation makes sense again. That restoration cannot be rushed. Trust returns slowly through consistent behavior over time, through policies that reward contribution rather than punish non participation, through environments that share risk instead of concentrating it. None of this can be achieved through taxation alone. The single tax attempts to shortcut a long term problem with a short term solution. It treats demographic decline as a compliance issue rather than a confidence issue. Confidence cannot be legislated, it must be cultivated. This requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths that people did not opt out because they are selfish. They opted out because the system stopped making sense for them. Men walking away are not rejecting society. They are rejecting arrangements that expose them to disproportionate risk without proportional reward. They are choosing lives that prioritize peace, predictability, and control over time. These choices are rational responses to uncertainty. Punishing rational behavior does not restore trust. It confirms distrust. As pressure increases, men do not rebel. They disengage further. They become harder to reach, harder to mobilize, harder to persuade. Eventually, institutions find themselves governing a population that no longer believes in them, only tolerates them. At that point, stability becomes an illusion. The lesson here extends beyond one country or one policy. It applies to any society facing declining participation. When people opt out, the first response should be understanding, not enforcement. Understanding leads to reform, enforcement leads to withdrawal. Japan's single tax will not encourage family formation. It will encourage minimalism. It will encourage distance. It will encourage people to reduce their footprint rather than expand it. The outcome will not be more families. It will be fewer commitments. The men who choose simplicity are not waiting to be convinced. They have already adapted. They have structured their lives to require less from systems they no longer trust. Reintegrating them would require rebuilding environments where commitment is safe again. That means predictable rules, balanced risk, fair expectations, respect for autonomy. And until those conditions exist, disengagement will continue. And disengagement, once normalized, becomes culture. Culture outlasts policy. This is why the stakes are higher than they appear. The issue is not revenue, it is legitimacy, it is trust. It is whether people believe their society works for them or merely extracts from them. Men walking away are not the end of society, but they are a warning that incentives are misaligned, that trust has eroded, that participation can no longer be assumed. Ignoring that warning does not make it go away, it makes it louder in its consequences. As systems become more extractive, people become more minimalist. As rules become more punitive, lives become more flexible. As pressure increases, attachment weakens. The path forward requires humility. It requires listening. It requires acknowledging that policies cannot replace trust. Trust must come first. Without it, no tax, no incentive, no penalty will reverse the trends now underway. So the question is not whether men will return to old patterns. The question is whether institutions will adapt to new realities, because people already have. And once people learn how little they truly need to live well, they do not easily return to systems that demand more while offering less. That is the reality policymakers must confront before it is too late. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed today. Do you agree with this analysis? Do you see these patterns playing out where you live? Leave a comment and share your thoughts below. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.